Welcome back, Otters. We are here again for our read aloud, so let's get started. We are still reading Pax, and we are on to chapter 27 now, which is back at Pax's perspective. Remember when we left off yesterday, Pax said that he was smelling something and it didn't seem safe, and he told Runt to get back into the den. Pax woke with a start. His boy was near. He jumped to his feet, waking Bristle, who had been dozing beside him, and began to search the clearing for Peter's scent. Nothing, but he was near. Pax bolted through the trees to the ridge above the encampment. He saw no youth among the war sick. He did not hear Peter's voice among the murmurs and shouts. He crept down the hill and circled the camp as close as he dared, scenting from all directions. His boy was not there. But he was near, and he was coming. Pax returned to Bristle's side and lay down, but he did not sleep. Chapter 28 is now Peter's perspective, and when we left him last, he was just given permission by one of the soldiers to go through the area that had been kind of like the people had left the area. And he said, like when he left last, he said something like, "Pax, I'm coming." So let's get started on Peter's perspective. Peter traveled south for almost an hour, feeling certain that Pax had traveled the same route. But when he emerged from the woods, he stopped. A vast meadow sloped down for at least a mile before flattening into another mile of wide green floor. At the base of that, the land rose hundreds of feet in jagged steps, as if chopped with a giant hoe. And beyond that, rolling to the horizon, was the forested plateau that hid the gorge. Since walking, he'd traveled 9 hours without thinking of rest once, but now the stunning immensity of the distance ahead drained what was left of his energy. He dropped his pack and fell to the ground. 9 hours of gripping the crutch handles had stiffened his hands to claws. He forced them open and felt the raw palms split. They'd blistered the day before, broken open and blistered again. He poured cool water from his thermos over the hot pulp of his palms and set to work picking out shreds of tire rubber. Then he eased his extra pair of socks over his hands and looked out again. A movement halfway down the valley caught his eye. Something trotted in bouncing dips between two trees. Fox movement. Peter rose to his knees. Pax! There it was again. But no, whatever was there was tan, not red. Coyote, maybe. The thought was a shot of adrenaline, and suddenly he was moving again, pack slamming against his back, crutches pistoning down the hill all the way to the valley bottom in just half an hour, and then sinking into the boggier ground there, muddy and slower, but still moving. And then a 10-foot sheer rock wall loomed in front of him. The cliffs were a lot taller than they had appeared from across the valley. Before he could second-guess himself, Peter hurled his pack and then his crutches up and heard them clatter onto a stony ledge. He wedged his fingers into a crevice and pulled. His cast scraped along the rough rock face, but his arms were strong from Vola's training, and he levered himself onto a shallow foothold. From there, he reached for a jutting tree, then another crack in the rock, and then he heaved himself over the first ledge. It took an hour to climb the stepped rise that way, crutches and pack first and dragging himself after. When he reached the crest, panting and sweat-soaked, he fell to the ground under a tall pine. He drained his thermos in one swallow and ate the last of the ham sandwiches. He opened Vola's second packet. Peanut butter. Peter's throat closed. He remembered the first time Pax had found an empty jar in the trash. He'd squeezed his snout in so deep it had gotten stuck, and Peter had laughed until it hurt. He stuffed the sandwich back into the bag, wishing he'd found it the day before, and tossed it to the dogs scavenging the dumpsters, and got up again. It was almost 6 o'clock, and he had a ways to go still. As he traveled, the memories of those hungry-eyed animals accompanied him, darting and retreating like accusing ghosts. He wished he could tell them that he knew how it felt to have the one person who had loved you and taken care of you suddenly vanish, how the world suddenly seemed dangerous after that. He had lost a parent. How many kids this week, he wondered, had woken up to find their worlds changed that way, their parents gone off to war, maybe never coming home. That was the worst, of course. But what about the smaller losses? How many kids missed their older brothers or sisters for months at a time? How many friends had had to say goodbye? How many kids were hungry? How many had had to move? How many pets had they had to leave behind to fend for themselves? And why didn't anyone count those things? People should tell the truth about what war costs, Vola had said. Weren't those things the costs of war, too? With a start, Peter found that the dark was falling around him. A little panicked, he should have been looking for a good place to settle for the night. He spun around. His left crutch shot out into a patch of loose stones. He fell onto it hard and heard a crisp snap. For an instant he feared rib, but the sound had been wood. He landed, still gripping the top of the crutch. 6 feet away was its bottom shank. Diabloman! It came out naturally, a satisfying word. He tried out some other swears, and they felt pretty good too. But the way the darkening woods absorbed his shouts without a response made him uneasy, so he stopped. He didn't have the luxury of venting anyway. He had a crutch to repair, and not much light left. All around him, trees shot out hardwood limbs that he could tape to the broken piece as a splint, but he had no hatchet to cut them. As he drew the bat out of his pack so he could find the tape, he realized that the solution was in his hand. He aligned the crutch pieces, laid the bat over them, then began winding the tape. When he was finished, he tested the crutch with his full weight. It held, strong and solid. He wished he could tell Vola she'd been right. He had needed her bat on his journey. He knelt by his pack again. The accident had been warning enough. He pulled out the things he needed to make camp for the night, then scraped a bowl in the dirt and filled it with a pile of twigs and dried grass. He touched a match to it, and a little fire crackled to life. Peter held his jackknife over the flames until he figured it was sterilized, then gritted his teeth and slit open the new blisters that had formed on his palms. The pain made him gasp, but he eased on some of Vola's salve and took deep breaths until it numbed. The herb smell swept him back to her kitchen with a rush, and he wondered if she was there now. How was she managing without that heavy leg to anchor her? Before he put his knife away, he held it up. The last of the firelight danced along its blade. He remembered the first time he'd seen Vola's knife, how shocked he'd been when she had gouged a chip of wood off her leg. Peter tugged up his jeans. He pressed the flat of the knife against his calf and tried to imagine slicing off a nugget of flesh because it offended him, because it wasn't perfect. A coyote howled then, and a second answered from a distance. Peter shivered. He turned the blade until the cool edge creased his flesh, then jerked it up. The slice was only half an inch, but its sting was fierce. There were advantages, he could see, to being made of wood. The cut beat it up. As the dark blood began to drip, he drew it into the shape of a leaping fox. With his fingernail, he pricked out a pointed nose, then 2 ears, a wild smear of his thumb for the brush. Pax tomorrow, a red fox blood vow. All right, otters, there is the end of our next 2 chapters for Read Aloud. Make sure to go back into Canvas to answer the 2 questions there. Please make sure to write in complete sentences with capital letters and punctuation as well. And I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.